They built a $1.7 billion steel tomb to contain the most dangerous object on the Earth. It was supposed to buy us a century of safety, but there is one problem. That thing inside is disappearing. The elephant's foot, the radioactive mass beneath Chernobyl, is slowly turning into microscopic radioactive dust. Dust that can slip through cracks, ride air currents, and bypass the very shield designed to trap it. The new Safe Confinement was built to trap a monster. Instead, that monster is becoming a ghost that can walk through walls. If scientists lose control of what's happening beneath Chernobyl, this disaster could enter a terrifying new phase. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Filter. Imagine an aircraft hangar the size of a small city block, rising 35 stories high and weighing nearly 40,000 tons. That is the new Safe Containment, or NSC, in a nutshell. It is a gleaming arch of steel, 843 feet wide and 356 feet tall. It doesn't sit on top of the reactor directly, it sits on top of the original confinement structure, a concrete shell that Soviet workers frantically built over the wreckage in the months after the 1986 disaster. They called the first structure the Sarcophagus, which is exactly as ominous as it sounds, like a pharaoh's tomb. It was built to seal something dangerous inside forever. Unlike the Egyptian tombs, the original encasement was built with all the structural integrity you would expect from something built in a panic. By the 2000s, it was cracking, rain was seeping in, and the entire structure was at risk of collapse. So the world built the NSC to encase the sarcophagus, a confinement structure around a confinement structure, like a hazmat suit pulled over a broken bandage. It is the world's largest movable land-based object, per one recent report. But it's far from a giant steel box sitting over the old reactor. It's alive, in a sense, constantly breathing. Massive ventilation systems pull air inward, passing it through industrial filtration units, and it maintains what engineers call negative pressure inside of the structure. Negative pressure is just a fancy way of saying the building is always inhaling and never exhaling. Air flows in, nothing flows out. At least nothing that hasn't first been passed through a filter designed to catch whatever toxins the ruins below are shedding. The filters are the critical line. Filters used in hospital operating rooms, the gold standard for clean air environments, can catch particles as small as 0.3 microns. That's roughly 3,000ths the width of a single hair. At that scale, you're stopping bacteria, smoke, and the overwhelming majority of radioactive dust particles floating around inside of the shelter. And the NSC's filtration systems are extremely good at it. These are not some giant furnace filters from Home Depot. They use dense mats of tangled fibers that trap particles through multiple mechanisms at once. Some slam directly into the fibers while others brush against them and stick, and the tiniest particles zigzag erratically through the air until they collide with the filter material through a process called Brownian motion. Ironically, the smallest particles are often easier to trap than the medium-sized ones. These filters reveal something terrifying. The NSC was never designed because Chernobyl was stable. It was designed because scientists knew the materials in Reactor 4 were still falling apart and crumbling into radioactive dust. Even then, what researchers began to see inside confinement was still unsettling. Sensors detected an increasing number of neutrons ricocheting around like, quote, the embers in a barbecue pit. At that point, this was more of a persistent danger. They knew they could have a problem. Not imminently dangerous, but one that gnaws at you simply because those neutron spikes weren't supposed to be happening. They were supposed to, quote, wink out on their own. And that feeling, knowing that something is wrong, but not knowing exactly how serious it is or what happens next, is something people can understand in a much more personal way too. Because sometimes stress doesn't arrive as one huge explosion. Sometimes it's quieter than that. It builds up in the background, keeps changing, and makes it hard to know what to do next. That's one reason therapy can be so valuable. It gives you space to slow down, sort through what you're feeling, and take one step at a time instead of treating everything like it has to be all or nothing. Therapy has helped me take what feels like a huge problem and break it down into something a lot more manageable. It's helped me focus on what I can do right now and make things less overwhelming. And that's why I'm glad BetterHelp is sponsoring this video. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. You can take a quick quiz and get matched with a licensed therapist. And if it doesn't feel like the right fit, you can switch anytime at no extra cost. You can also communicate in whatever feels the most comfortable for you, whether that's phone, video, or text. Sometimes progress isn't about fixing everything all at once. Sometimes it's just about having the support and perspective to move forward a little more clearly. So if you've been thinking about trying therapy, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/infographics to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Now back to Chernobyl. The original expectation was that this degradation process would gradually stabilize over time. Instead, measurements inside the shelter suggested something far more unpredictable. The environment remained active and dynamic. It was still changing decades after the explosion. In theory, the damaged core should mostly produce coarse radioactive particles, fragments, debris, and heavy dust. This is the kind of contamination modern industrial filtration systems are designed to capture relatively easily. But scientists were also detecting increases in neutron activity in several subreactor rooms. And that was a concern. It suggested the fuel-containing material wasn't just physically falling apart, its physical evolution was actually sparking new nuclear reactions. It was cracking, shifting, drying out, and rearranging in ways that triggered new fission. This made its long-term behavior increasingly difficult to predict. Chernobyl's Unit 4 reactor core hasn't really stopped since 1986. A chemical concoction far more sinister than ordinary debris is bubbling away. When Reactor 4 exploded, its core melted together like lava, fusing the reactor's uranium fuel, control rods, metal cladding, and a molten mixture of concrete, steel, zirconium, graphite, and even sand into a new substance called corium. Peaking at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the corium mass flowed downward, hardened into stalagmites and stalactites and lava flows, and it became what scientists call fuel-containing materials, or FCM. They still hold about 95% of the reactor's original uranium. Under the right conditions, that mass can still flirt with one thing Chernobyl was never supposed to do again: sustain a nuclear reaction. In 2021, scientists published multiple reports stating that these FCMs were actively disintegrating, producing a radioactive dust that complicated original plans to dismantle the original sarcophagus. Today, the elephant's foot, the most famous of those formations, is more or less the consistency of hard, compacted sand. The NSC is doing exactly what it was designed to do: keep particles in. The problem is that what's inside is no longer behaving like what the design assumed. Something has changed inside the confinement. That's the thread we need to start pulling, and to understand where it leads, we'll have to go back to the night everything began and reckon with the possibility that what we've been told about that night has always been missing something. Chapter 2. The nature of the first explosion. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 was running a routine safety test that felt anything but routine. It was being pushed into unstable territory to see what happens when the power goes out. Soviet operators juggled with alarms, overrides, and a reactor that was already behaving like it had a mind of its own. Soon, the power dipped too low and then spiked fast. Too fast. The official story says what happened next was simple. Water inside the reactor flashed to steam. Pressure built. The resulting explosion blew the 1,000-ton lid off the reactor like a champagne cork. As the core was exposed, graphite ignited, and the subsequent fire burned for 10 days. That's the version the Soviet Union gave the world. It is in the textbooks. It is the story. But there's a problem. Somewhere else, nearly 620 miles away, in the Russian city of Chernobyl, scientists were detecting something strange in the air: radioactive xenon gas. Now, xenon doesn't just show up for no reason. It's a fission product which gives a unique calling card, a fingerprint if you will, and this fingerprint didn't match the official story. This specific mix of xenon isotopes they found wasn't consistent with a damaged reactor slowly falling apart. It pointed to something more violent, an intense burst of nuclear fission happening right at the moment of the explosion. Swedish physicist Lars-Erik de Geer looked into this decades later. Using atmospheric models, he traced the xenon cloud's origins and, more importantly, how it got there. It did not follow the main plume drifting toward Europe. It shot high into the atmosphere, caught by a completely different wind current, and that only happens if something launches material upward with extreme force, far more than a steam explosion alone. De Geer's conclusion: the first blast wasn't just a steam explosion, it was a literal nuclear explosion. A rapid, uncontrolled burst of fission ripped through parts of the core first, and then seconds later the steam explosion finished the job, tearing the reactor apart. Think of it like pulling a trigger before a bomb goes off. That first blast might have been small by comparison, but it was nuclear in nature, and that matters. Whatever produced that burst did not vanish when the dust settled. Its fingerprints are still locked inside the melted core, inside the fuel-containing materials. The Gears theory isn't universally accepted, but it raised a question that refuses to go away. If Chernobyl went briefly nuclear before it went mechanical, what exactly is down there? Chapter 3, Room 3052, The Pulse. Deep beneath Reactor 4, past shattered concrete and twisted steel and into a maze no humans can safely enter, lies Room 3052. It sounds harmless, but don't let that deceive you. This is the room where part of the reactor ended up when the glowing corium slurry ate its way downward like lava and then cooled. Whatever is down there has been sitting in the dark since 1986, but not quietly. Nobody can go back down to check. The radiation would kill you in minutes. So scientists did the next best thing. They wired the room with sensors and they let the reactor core speak for itself. If you want to know whether nuclear fission is happening somewhere, you count the neutrons. Every time a uranium atom splits, it fires off neutrons like microscopic bullets. Those neutrons hit other atoms, splitting them, releasing more neutrons, a chain reaction. The more neutrons you detect, the more fission is happening. So when the sensors in room 3052 started picking up more neutrons, people paid attention. Between 2016 and 2021, neutron levels jumped by roughly 40%, in some cases nearly double. The leading suspect was water. For decades, groundwater seeped into the ruins. Oddly enough, that helped keep things stable. Water actually slows neutrons down, and slower neutrons are more likely to cause fission, but water also absorbs them, and it acts as both an accelerator and a brake. For years, the brake was winning. And then came the NSC. By sealing the reactor and controlling the environment, it reduced the amount of groundwater getting into the system. Less water means less braking. If you could picture a campfire buried under wet ash for decades, silently smoldering and barely alive, you might get a sense of what's going on. When the ash dries out, whatever's underneath will start to glow again. To be clear, this is not a second Chernobyl explosion waiting to happen. Most experts think the geometry of the material doesn't allow for that kind of runaway reaction. If things heat up too much, the system would likely choke itself off. But they don't know for sure. Nobody does. What they do know for sure is that the core is not dead. It is reacting, generating new fission, radiation, and heat. And that energy doesn't stay buried forever. It moves upwards. A few kilometers away on the surface, something else was about to disturb the ground above Reactor 4, without any idea of what might be waking up underneath. Chapter 4, The Red Forest Disturbance. A few miles from Reactor 4, there's a forest that shouldn't exist, and that's because in 1986 it allegedly died. The radiation hit it so hard that the pine trees turned a rusted orange-red almost overnight. Then they collapsed where they stood. Bulldozers came through, they buried what they could, and they left the rest to rot. They called it the Red Forest, and today it looks eerily normal. On the surface, trees have grown back, birds fly through it, and the wind moves through the branches like any other forest on the earth. But go underground and the forest reveals roots far more sinister. For nearly 5 decades, the soil has been quietly collecting everything Chernobyl threw into the air. That includes radioactive dust, fallout, ionizing particles carried by the rain and the wind, and anything else the violent explosion cycled into the environment over and over. Layer by layer, it remains one of the most contaminated places on the Earth. And in February 2022, Russian tanks rolled straight through it. Putin's armored columns, part of his special military operation to invade Ukraine, pushed toward Kyiv by cutting right across the exclusion zone. Heavily tracked vehicles churned the soil, digging, grinding, and kicking up decades of radioactive material into the air as a consequence. The local plant workers could only watch until their sensors started lighting up. Radiation monitors began reporting spikes. Some stations registered gamma levels 20, even 30 times higher than normal, which is not very subtle. When scientists went back and they looked closely at the data, however, the pattern didn't make sense. Some sensors far from the military convoy spiked, while others closer by didn't. A 2023 study dug into the readings and completely debunked the dust theory. The sensors were spiking miles away from the roads. In other words, where the tanks definitely kicked up radioactive dust locally, that physical dust didn't cause the massive sensor spikes. Their electronic warfare weapons likely scrambled the network. Despite that, the chemical toxicity of the soil is actually getting worse. Back in 1986, the fallout included a radioactive isotope called plutonium-241. It doesn't stick around forever. It actually decays relatively quickly. What it turns into when it does decay is the real problem. Americium-241, longer-lived, more persistent, and in some ways more dangerous as it emits alpha radiation. It won't travel far in the air, but if it does get inside your body, it'll dump the energy straight into your cells. Your lung tissue, your bones, anywhere it settles, it'll keep irradiating, converting into something nastier. Whatever those tanks kicked up in 2022, it was not the same material that fell in 1986. It was something even more toxic and refined. And not everything in the red forest stays on the surface or in the air. Some of it sinks down through the soil and into the groundwater spaces beneath the reactor, the same spaces where room 3052 is showing signs of renewed life. Chapter 5: The Invisible Highway. Everything we've talked about so far, the radiation, the dust, the molten fuel, it all seemed contained. But beneath the exclusion zone is a hidden system of underground rivers, layers of water-bearing rock and soil called aquifers. When rain falls, it seeps into the ground and begins a slow journey through those aquifers all the way to the Dnieper River. It's the main water source for Kyiv, home to 3 million people and tens of millions more across the region. If you'd asked scientists back in 1986 whether anything from Chernobyl was getting into that system, they'd have had a reassuring answer. Under the site is a thick layer of clay, and clay is dense and sticky, almost impermeable actually. They hoped that anything that hit that clay barrier would be stopped dead in its tracks, or at least move so slowly that the radiation would decay away long before it reached anything important. There was a huge problem though. When later surveys found out that the original models didn't recognize that Chernobyl's clay wasn't actually solid, it was laced with cracks and threaded with tiny pathways where the water could slip through. The water flowing through those cracks was carrying passengers too. Scientists called them colloids, basically microscopic particles suspended in the water, too small to settle and too big to ignore. The most important part is that radioactive elements love them. Plutonium, for example, was supposed to stay locked into the soil, basically immobile, but in this case it started hitching rides, clinging on to those tiny particles and moving with the water. It slipped through fractures, bypassed natural barriers, and traveled farther and faster than anyone predicted. The original safety models imagined contamination slowly crawling through the dirt. What they found instead were waterborne highways, whose eventual reach proved virtually impossible to measure. A long-term study published in 2022 confirmed that radioactive elements like cesium, strontium, and even plutonium are already present in the groundwater beneath Chernobyl. The system does dilute and slow them down over time, but the transport mechanisms are more complicated than anyone thought. Containment worked, just not the way we thought it would, with the system connecting outward through deep aquifers and regional geology. It feeds into the same watershed supplying one of Europe's largest populations. Every part of this points back to one place, the source, where something inside the reactor is still alive and producing material that isn't behaving in the way it's supposed to. Chapter 6: The Sarcophagus Myth. By this point, it's safe to say that Chernobyl's core is not behaving like a dead object. The logic of the NSC was just to buy some time. It was temporary, a 100-year shelter designed so engineers could eventually dismantle the ruins. But that plan rested on a single assumption that the nuclear reactions were finished. And to be fair, the NSC itself works beautifully. Its steel arches are structurally sound, the ventilation system runs well, the filtration systems operate exactly within their specifications. Engineering is not a problem. The problem is that the engineers designed the structure for a dormant, decaying reactor, and Chernobyl did not read the manual. The NSC was built to stop radioactive dust escaping from a static solid mass. Instead, scientists are increasingly dealing with something more like a chemically unstable radioactive glass monster that keeps crumbling, shifting, reacting, and occasionally throwing off little hints that nuclear fission may still be occurring underground. It is not ideal. And that's really the story here. The neutron spikes, the groundwater contamination, weird aerosol particles, they're all symptoms and evidence of something physical happening inside the reactor core itself. If the core were truly inert and the original models held, these signals would be fading, not evolving, and sometimes getting stronger 40 years later. So scientists went back to the source, back to the molten remains of Reactor 4. What they found was worse than simple contamination. Chapter 7: The Disintegrating Foot. All of this brings us back to where we started, the elephant's foot. After all this time, it remains one of the deadliest objects humanity has ever created. Look at a photo of it, and you're apt to just think of it as a rock. A big radioactive rock, except it's really radioactive glass. And that is a horrifyingly important distinction. Back in 1986, Reactor 4 got so hot that everything inside the reactor melted together into glowing sludge that flowed through the reactor building like lava. When it cooled, the most famous chunk became the elephant's foot, and for years scientists assumed the massive black formation of uranium-rich silicate glass packed with radioactive isotopes was mostly finished changing. Another bad assumption, since glass is not permanent, and radioactive glass is basically being beaten to death from the inside by its own atoms. Every radioactive decay event inside of the foot releases energy in the form of alpha particles, gamma rays, and beta decay. These tiny microscopic impacts hammer the material non-stop for decades. It is just enough to slowly pulverize the mass and not make it explode dramatically. But bond by bond, atom by atom, the mass evolves. Eventually things are bound to crack, and that's what scientists are seeing. Back in the 1990s, the elephant's foot looked so dense and permanent that scientists needed to use a Kalashnikov rifle with armor-piercing rounds just to chip off a sample for analysis. Today, scientists say parts of it have the consistency of sand, and that is not what you want from your run-of-the-mill radioactive lava. The dust that sheds off the sand is crumbling in a way that makes all the latest aerosol readings make better sense. But it gets worse. As the material fractures internally, the uranium trapped inside shifts position. Concentrations rearrange as pockets form, and in certain conditions, as the reactor spaces dry out, that rearrangement may help explain the rising neutron activity scientists detected in room 3052. The core is aging very badly, like a toxic jello mold slowly turning itself into airborne powder while sitting on top of Europe's water table. The removal plan, well, it's still under development. And that's the uncomfortable reality sitting under the largest movable structure on the Earth. Chernobyl is not asleep, it's awake, and it's grinding itself into something even harder to contain than the day we sealed it away. But to understand why it ended up like this in the first place, you have to go back to the moment everything failed and the mistakes that were made. Find out the real story in Chernobyl Nuclear Explosion Disaster Explained Hour by Hour. Or watch this instead.